They once filled halls, topped charts, and shaped the sound of country music. But when the applause faded and the phone stopped ringing, many of these icons spent their final years believing the world had moved on without them. This video is about 10 country legends who died thinking they were forgotten, never knowing their songs were still playing, their voices still remembered, and their influence still alive. Sometimes the cruelest tragedy isn't failure. It's never realizing how much you truly mattered. Lefty Frizzell. For a brief but powerful moment, Lefty Frizzell stood at the very center of country music. In the early 1950s, his smooth phrasing and relaxed vocal timing changed how country singers approached a song. Hits like "If You've Got the Money, I've Got the Time" didn't just top the charts, they rewrote the rules. Younger artists listened closely. Merle Haggard would later admit he modeled his entire vocal style after Lefty. At his peak, Frizzell wasn't just successful, he was essential. But the rise was fast and the fall was quieter. As musical tastes shifted and Nashville began favoring cleaner images and tighter control, Lefty struggled to adapt. Alcohol abuse, missed performances, and clashes with record labels slowly pushed him out of the spotlight. By the 1960s, the man who once defined modern country was already being treated as a relic of a past era. The most painful part wasn't just the loss of fame, it was the silence that followed. Lefty watched younger artists thrive using techniques he had pioneered, yet his own name was mentioned less and less. Radio stopped calling, tours dried up, invitations disappeared. In interviews late in life, Frizzell spoke like a man who believed his chapter had already been closed and forgotten. He seemed convinced that whatever he had given to country music had been erased by time. By the time of his death in 1975, Lefty Frizzell carried that belief with him. He died thinking his influence had faded, that his legacy belonged to dusty record bins and fading memories. What he never truly knew was that his voice lived on every time Merle Haggard sang, every time George Jones bent a lyric just behind the beat, every time a country singer chose emotion over polish. Today, historians call Lefty Frizzell one of the most influential vocal stylists in country history. His impact never disappeared. It simply became invisible to him while he was still alive. That quiet misunderstanding may be the saddest part of his story. Keith Whitley. Keith Whitley's voice sounded like it carried decades of heartbreak, even when he was still a young man. By the late 1980s, he had finally broken through after years of struggle, delivering songs that felt raw, intimate, and painfully honest. When You Say Nothing at All and Don't Close Your Eyes weren't just hits. They revealed a singer who could express vulnerability in a genre often dominated by toughness. For many fans, Whitley felt like the future of country music. But behind the growing success was a deep sense of insecurity. Whitley had spent so long fighting for recognition that he struggled to believe it would last. Years of rejection had left their mark. Even as his songs climbed the charts, he reportedly worried that the industry could turn on him at any moment. He saw country music as a place that quickly forgot its own, and he feared he would be no different. Alcohol had been a constant presence in his life, long before fame arrived. As pressure increased, so did his reliance on it. Friends later described a man torn between sudden success and the lingering belief that he didn't truly belong. Whitley spoke like someone who felt his career was fragile, temporary, and easily replaceable. When he died in 1989 at just 34 years old, Keith Whitley never lived long enough to see what followed. In his mind, his story was unfinished. He died believing he had only brushed against greatness, unsure whether his music would endure once the spotlight moved on. There was no way for him to know how wrong that fear would prove to be. After his death, Whitley's reputation grew rather than faded. Fellow artists openly cited him as a defining influence. His songs became standards. New generations discovered his voice and felt the same emotional pull that audiences had felt decades earlier. In time, Keith Whitley came to be regarded as one of the purest singers country music ever produced. The tragedy is not only that he died young, but that he died without knowing how deeply he mattered. His legacy outlived him, stronger, louder, and more lasting than he ever believed possible. Billy Joe Shaver. Billy Joe Shaver was never meant to be polished, and he never fit comfortably inside Nashville's rules. In the 1970s, his songwriting helped define the outlaw country movement, a raw and rebellious alternative to the industry's clean image. Songs like Old Five and Dimers Like Me carried a brutal honesty that resonated deeply with artists who valued truth over radio formulas. Waylon Jennings recorded his work, and insiders knew Shaver was the real thing. Yet recognition never followed him the way it followed others. While the outlaw image became profitable, Billy Joe remained on the margins. He lived through poverty, addiction, and relentless personal tragedy. Record deals came and went. Albums were praised but barely promoted. As Nashville moved towards slicker commercial sounds, Shaver was left behind, his name known mostly to musicians rather than the mainstream audience. The losses in his personal life were devastating. His mother died by suicide. His wife passed away from cancer. Most crushing of all, his son Eddie, his closest collaborator and bandmate, died from a heroin overdose. Each tragedy deepened Shaver's sense that life had taken more than it ever gave back. In later interviews, he often spoke like a man who felt forgotten, tolerated at best, and never fully acknowledged for what he had contributed. By his final years, Billy Joe Shaver believed his legacy was small and fragile. He performed in modest venues, far from the spotlight he once brushed against. While younger artists cited outlaw country as an influence, Shaver seemed convinced that the movement had moved on without him. He didn't speak like a legend. He spoke like someone who assumed history had already passed judgment and quietly dismissed him. When he died in 2020, the reaction told a very different story. Tributes poured in from across the country music world. Fellow artists called him one of the greatest songwriters who ever lived. Fans revisited his catalog, discovering just how deeply his words had shaped the genre. What Billy Joe Shaver never truly knew was that his influence didn't fade. It waited. He died thinking he was a footnote. In reality, Tom T. Hall. Tom T. Hall was known as the storyteller, a title he earned not through image or controversy, but through an unmatched ability to turn everyday lives into unforgettable songs. In the late 1960s and 1970s, Hall's writing stood apart. He didn't chase glamour or fantasy. He wrote about ordinary people, quiet heartbreaks, and small moments that felt deeply human. Songs like Harper Valley PTA and I Love made him one of the most respected voices in country music, both commercially and critically. At his peak, Tom T. Hall wasn't just successful, he was trusted. Country audiences believed him. Nashville relied on him. His songs felt honest in a way few others managed, and his influence spread far beyond the charts. Yet as country music evolved, that kind of storytelling slowly lost its place at the center of the industry. Production grew louder. Images grew bigger. Subtlety became harder to sell. Hall responded by stepping back. Unlike others who fought to stay relevant, he withdrew quietly. He stopped chasing radio, avoided interviews, and retreated from the public eye. Over time, that absence created a painful illusion. With fewer appearances and little media attention, Tom T. Hall began to believe that the world had simply moved on without him. He spoke openly about feeling disconnected from modern country, as if the genre no longer had room for the kind of stories he told. In his later years, Hall lived far from the spotlight, convinced that his work belonged to another era, one no longer remembered or valued. While younger artists built careers on songwriting authenticity, he seemed unaware that they were walking paths he helped create. He didn't see tribute albums, academic praise, or the quiet reverence songwriters still held for his catalog. From his perspective, the silence felt final. When Tom T. Hall died in 2021, the reaction was immediate and profound. Musicians, writers, and historians called him irreplaceable. Fans revisited his songs and found them timeless, not dated. His storytelling hadn't vanished. It had simply stopped being loud. The tragedy is that Tom T. Hall spent his final years believing his voice no longer mattered, never realizing that his stories were still being told, still being studied, and still shaping country music long after he stepped away. Gene Shepard. Gene Shepard was one of the strongest voices to emerge from country music's classic era, at a time when women were rarely given equal space or respect. In the early 1950s, she became one of the first female country stars to achieve sustained success, scoring major hits with songs like A Dear John Letter. Her voice carried defiance, vulnerability, and grit, qualities that spoke directly to working-class women who rarely heard their lives reflected in music. At her height, Jean Shepard wasn't just popular. She was groundbreaking. She stood on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry when female performers were still treated as exceptions rather than equals. She fought openly against Nashville's double standards, refusing to soften her image or her sound. For a time, she was proof that women could carry traditional country music with the same authority as any man. But as decades passed, the industry changed, and not in her favor. Country music leaned increasingly toward polished country pop, where youth and image mattered more than authenticity. Shepard's traditional style was quietly pushed aside. Radio airplay faded. New generations of fans were rarely introduced to her work. While male legends from her era were celebrated as timeless, Jean Shepard felt herself slipping into the background. In later interviews, she spoke with a mixture of pride and resignation. She knew what she had accomplished, but she also believed the world had largely forgotten it. She watched as the history of country music was retold without fully acknowledging the women who helped build it. There was a sense that her contributions had been reduced to footnotes, overshadowed by louder names and flashier careers. When Jean Shepard died in 2016, she carried that quiet belief with her, that her era had passed, and so had the public's memory of her. What she didn't fully see was how deeply she was still respected behind the scenes. Female country artists continued to cite her as a pioneer. Historians recognized her as a barrier breaker. Her recordings endured as examples of unfiltered, uncompromising country music. Jean Shepard died thinking she belonged to a forgotten chapter. In reality, she helped write the book, and generations are still reading it, even if she never got to hear them say her name out loud. Stonewall Jackson. For a time, Stonewall Jackson's name was impossible to ignore in country music. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, he delivered a string of hard-hitting honky-tonk hits that resonated with everyday listeners. Songs like Waterloo and Why I'm Walkin' made him a familiar voice on radios across America. He was a regular presence on the Grand Ole Opry, standing shoulder to shoulder with the era's biggest names. Stonewall's style was direct and unapologetic. He didn't chase polish or crossover appeal. His music reflected grit, heartbreak, and working-class pride, exactly what country audiences of the time wanted. At his peak, he wasn't chasing trends. He was helping define what traditional country music sounded like. But the industry changed faster than he could follow. As Nashville began favoring smoother productions and younger faces, Stonewall Jackson's raw sound was quietly pushed aside. Radio support faded. Record labels lost interest. By the late 1960s, his chart presence had nearly vanished. Unlike some peers who reinvented themselves, Jackson found himself on the outside looking in. The silence weighed heavily on him. In later years, he spoke like a man who believed his moment had not only passed, but been erased. Invitations to major events slowed. His name appeared less often in retrospectives. To Stonewall, it felt as though country music had moved on and left him behind entirely. Health issues and personal struggles only deepened that sense of isolation. By the time of his death in 2012, Stonewall Jackson believed he was largely forgotten, a former Opry star reduced to a memory few still cared about. What he never fully realized was that his music had never disappeared. His recordings continued to circulate among traditional country fans. Younger artists rediscovered his catalog as a blueprint for authentic honky-tonk sound. After his passing, tributes highlighted his role in preserving country music's raw core during a time of rapid change. Historians placed him firmly among the genre's essential voices. The tragedy is that Stonewall Jackson lived his final years convinced he no longer mattered, unaware that his work still stood as a reminder of what country music once was, and still could be. Vern Gosdin. Vern Gosdin possessed one of the purest, most emotionally devastating voices country music ever produced. Fellow artists called him The Voice, a nickname earned not through hype, but through the way he could turn heartbreak into something almost unbearable to hear. In the late 1970s and 1980s, songs like Chiseled in Stone and I Can Tell by the Way You Dance showcased a singer who understood pain not as a performance, but as lived experience. Despite critical acclaim and deep respect within the industry, Gosdin never fully broke through to superstar status. He scored hits, but never enjoyed the kind of sustained promotion or media attention that turns artists into household names. Record label problems followed him throughout his career, cutting short momentum just as his music was gaining traction. Each setback reinforced a feeling that success was always just out of reach. As country music shifted towards slicker production and broader crossover appeal, Gosdin's traditional, emotionally heavy style began to feel out of step with Nashville's priorities. Radio airplay declined, tours grew smaller. While younger singers borrowed heavily from the emotional honesty he helped define, Vern himself faded further into the background. He watched the genre change and quietly concluded that there was no longer a place for someone like him. In interviews late in life, Gosdin spoke with humility, but also resignation. He never talked like a legend. He talked like a man who believed he had been overlooked, someone whose best work had slipped past the world without leaving a mark. Health problems and personal struggles compounded that belief, making the silence feel permanent rather than temporary. When Vern Gosdin died in 2009, he did so thinking his legacy was modest at best. He had no way of knowing what followed. Tributes poured in from artists who credited him as a defining influence. Chiseled in Stone was routinely cited as one of the greatest heartbreak songs in country history. Fans rediscovered his catalog and spoke about his voice with near reverence. The cruel irony is that Vern Gosdin never realized how deeply his music had burrowed into the soul of country music. He died believing he was barely remembered. Unaware that his voice had already secured a place few singers ever reach. Timeless, irreplaceable, and endlessly felt. Mel Street. Mel Street's voice sounded like a confession whispered after midnight. In the 1970s, his recordings captured a kind of emotional honesty that cut straight through the noise of the era. Songs like Borrowed Angel spoke openly about loneliness, regret, and quiet desperation, subjects many listeners felt but rarely heard expressed so plainly. For a certain audience, Mel Street wasn't just another country singer. He felt painfully real, yet his success was narrow and fragile. While Borrowed Angel became a defining song for him, it also boxed him in. Radio support was inconsistent, and his career never developed the momentum needed to carry him beyond a handful of recognizable hits. He toured relentlessly, often in small venues, trying to hold on to an audience that seemed to be shrinking rather than growing. Behind the scenes, Mel Street struggled deeply with mental health. Depression followed him for years, and the emotional weight of his songs mirrored his private life more closely than anyone realized. As country music moved toward brighter sounds and more commercial optimism, Street's bleak honesty felt increasingly out of step. The industry didn't know what to do with an artist who refused to hide his pain. In his final years, Mel Street spoke and acted like someone who believed his career had already ended in obscurity. He saw himself as a singer who had been briefly noticed and then quietly discarded. The applause had faded, the phone calls stopped, and the sense of being needed disappeared. To him, it felt as though his voice no longer mattered in a genre that once seemed to understand him. In 1978, Mel Street took his own life at just 44 years old. He died believing that his music had failed to leave a lasting impression, that whatever connection he once had with listeners had dissolved. What he never truly knew was how deeply Borrowed Angel had embedded itself into the emotional memory of country fans. Long after his death, the song continued to resonate with people who saw their own struggles reflected in its lyrics. Today, Mel Street is often remembered as a tragic figure, but more importantly, as an honest one. His music didn't disappear. It waited quietly for listeners who needed it. The tragedy is that Mel Street never lived long enough to realize that even in his darkest moments, he was never as forgotten as he believed. Charlie Walker. Charlie Walker was never the loudest name in country music, but for years, he was one of its most reliable voices. In the 1960s, Walker built a steady career rooted in traditional country values, clear storytelling, emotional restraint, and songs that felt lived in rather than performed. Hits like Pick Me Up on Your Way Down and The Tall, Tall Trees earned him chart success and a respected place on the Grand Ole Opry stage. He wasn't chasing stardom. He was building trust. At his peak, Charlie Walker was exactly the kind of artist country music depended on. He delivered songs that radio could rely on and audiences believed. His presence wasn't flashy, but it was consistent. For listeners who valued authenticity over spectacle, Walker represented the quiet backbone of the genre. But that kind of career came with a hidden cost. As country music evolved and began favoring bigger personalities and more aggressive marketing, artists like Charlie Walker slowly disappeared from view. He didn't reinvent himself. He didn't provoke controversy. He simply continued doing what he had always done, until the industry stopped paying attention. By the 1970s, radio airplay faded. New contracts never came. Walker remained connected to the Opry, but the wider public conversation moved on without him. Over time, the absence of recognition began to feel personal. Friends later described a man who spoke as if his contributions had quietly evaporated, as though his years of work had left no lasting mark. In his later life, Charlie Walker lived modestly, far from the spotlight. He didn't complain publicly, but his words suggested resignation. He believed his era was over and forgotten, that newer generations had no reason to remember a singer who never tried to stand out. The silence around his name felt permanent to him. When Charlie Walker died in 2008, he carried that belief with him. What he never truly saw was how his songs endured among traditional country fans and historians. His recordings remained touchstones for those who valued classic structure and emotional honesty. Within the Opry community, he was remembered as a professional's professional, dependable, sincere, and essential. Charlie Walker died thinking he had faded into obscurity. In reality, he had become something quieter and rarer, a reminder of a time when country music didn't need to shout to be heard. Hank Snow. For decades, Hank Snow was one of the most dependable hitmakers in country music. From the late 1940s through the 1950s, his voice dominated radio with songs like I'm Movin' On and The Golden Rocket. He was a cornerstone of the Grand Ole Opry and a bridge between country's early roots and its post-war boom. At his peak, Hank Snow was not just successful, he was unavoidable. Yet his career unfolded in a way that later haunted him. Snow helped open doors for younger artists, most famously Johnny Cash, whom he supported early on. As those artists went on to become towering legends, Snow gradually slipped into the background. His contributions were acknowledged, but rarely celebrated with the same reverence. Over time, he began to feel less like a pioneer and more like a stepping stone. As country music entered new eras, Hank Snow's clean, traditional style felt increasingly old-fashioned. Radio embraced newer sounds. Television favored bigger personalities. While his songs remained part of country's foundation, his name was mentioned less often when the genre's history was retold. Snow noticed the shift. In later years, he spoke with quiet bitterness about feeling overlooked, as though his role had been reduced to a footnote behind the stars he once helped launch. By the 1980s and 1990s, Snow lived largely outside the spotlight. Though he remained respected within industry circles, public attention had moved elsewhere. He watched as anniversaries passed without major recognition, and as younger fans learned country history through simplified narratives that rarely placed him at the center. To Hank Snow, it felt like the world remembered the results, but not the man who helped make them possible. When he died in 1999, Hank Snow believed his legacy had been diminished by time. He didn't fully see how deeply his work still mattered. Today, historians credit him as one of the most influential transitional figures in country music, a singer who helped carry the genre into its modern form. His recordings remain standards, studied and revered by musicians who understand where the road truly began. Hank Snow died thinking he had been quietly eclipsed. In truth, he was never erased, only hidden behind the shadows of the giants who followed the path he cleared.